Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Simon Magakian, and I am the conference chair for Nagorno-Karabakh today and tomorrow. An important event that brought together experts from this country and across the world to discuss political, cultural, and legal matters concerning Armenian existence in Artsakh. We have an opportunity today to hear from our moderators who will summarize the conference findings. But before we do that, I'd like to read a communiqué from the conference participants. The conference on the subject Nagorno-Karabakh today and tomorrow, convened in Los Angeles, United States of America, November 11th through 13th, 2022, gathered top experts from across the world to discuss cultural preservation, geopolitics, diplomacy, and legal matters concerning Armenian existence in Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh. The current conference is the fourth in a series of international conferences in Holy Etchmiadzin, Armenia, Austria, the Russian Federation, on the timely topic of the preservation of the cultural heritage of Nagorno-Karabakh. And this communiqué reflects the principal formulations of the preceding conferences. Meeting in Los Angeles, by the blessings of His Holiness Karakin II, Catholicos of all Armenians, and under the auspices of His Eminence Archbishop Hovnander Deryan, Primate of the Western Diocese of the Armenian Church, we, conference participants from around the world, are deeply moved and inspired by the faith and resilience of the Armenian people in Nagorno-Karabakh. Furthermore, we are also profoundly concerned with the consequences of the horrors of the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war launched by Azerbaijan and the ongoing aggression against the sovereign territories of the Republic of Armenia. The discussions highlighted the critical importance of the protection of the living Armenian cultural heritage in Nagorno-Karabakh as physical sites and critically as a way of life for the people of Artsakh. There are serious concerns regarding the preservation of the monuments that came under Azerbaijani control as a result of the recent war, taking into consideration the consistent practice of Azerbaijan of destruction of Armenian cultural heritage in its territories in the past. For example, after Armenian-populated Nakhichevan came under the control of Azerbaijan, its Armenian cultural heritage was entirely annihilated between 1997 and 2006. 89 churches, as well as around 6,000 khachkars, cross stones, and over 22,000 tombstones across Nakhichevan were destroyed. The acts of vandalism committed by Azerbaijan are an extension of an ongoing policy towards Armenians that began several decades ago. This consistent policy has two clearly defined directions. On the one hand, the complete elimination of Armenian heritage, and on the other hand, the misappropriation of Armenian heritage for the same purpose, whereby effacing the inscriptions in Armenian from the walls of the medieval churches and gravestones, they're then reclassified and represented to be Caucasian Albanian. The claims of Azerbaijan regarding the origin of the Armenian churches of Artsakh are a distortion and falsification of historical facts. The purpose of this policy of politicized historiography and historical revisionism is to eliminate every trace of Armenians from the region. This international gathering underlined the urgency for the government of Azerbaijan to allow immediate and unimpeded international access to the areas of Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, which have come under Azerbaijan's control for the purpose of independent assessment and monitoring missions. The government of Azerbaijan must hold and seize the activities of the so-called working group on eliminating Armenian traces from historical monuments and allow independent international cultural heritage professional and monitoring groups of the UNESCO and other relevant organizations to monitor the current state of the monuments of Nagorno-Karabakh. Relevant stakeholders, particularly the OSCE Minsk Group co-chairs should ensure the fundamental rights to access places of worship and cemeteries. The organizers pledged to continue the work together in the implementation of a more detailed action plan to be issued shortly after the conference to address the concerns raised during these conferences in Holy Echmiadzin, Armenia, Austria, the Russian Federation, and the current conference in the United States of America. Finally, the international community must exert the necessary pressure to ensure Azerbaijan's compliance with assumed international obligations with regard to preservation of fundamental human rights and liberties, including preservation of cultural heritage. Adopted today on November the 13th, 2022. Next, we're going to invite the organizers of the two previous conferences. First, Dr. Yasmin Duntragut to tell us about the conference that recently happened in Vienna, Austria.
Thank you so much for inviting me to give you a report on the conference we had in May in Vienna. And I'm so happy because I can also show you that conferences or to organize conferences really makes sense, because after the closing of our conference in Vienna, we immediately started to work, and I can also show you some results of the conference. The outcome of the conference are really important. So in May 22, we organized an international conference and workshop titled Culture in Conflict, South Caucasus Today, at the very famous Museum of Art History in the very center of Vienna, in the Imperial Center of Vienna, actually in the former palace of the Austrian-Hungarian Emperor. When we started to think about the conference, we knew that there would be two objectives. The first of all would be to raise awareness. Why? Because especially in Austria and in general in Europe, little is known about Artsakh, and especially about the cultural heritage of Artsakh and the long Christian history of Artsakh. So the first objective was to raise awareness, to give a lot of information about the history and the culture of Artsakh. So when we thought about how to raise awareness, of course, to invite specialists from Armenia, but also in our visual world, to do something to attract the interest of a broader public. So this gave us the idea to organize two exhibitions. So one exhibition was held at my university in Salzburg and was organized and curated by my Division of Armenian Studies with the help of the Archbishop of Salzburg, His Eminence Franz Lackner, and the Institute for Research of Armenian Architecture. This exhibition is a photo exhibition of monasteries and churches, both in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Artsakh, and also in the now on the territories which are now under Azerbaijani control. This exhibition is still on display. And second, we organized also an exhibition in Vienna, which was quite interesting because we organized it in the premises of the Methodist fathers in Vienna, because we found out that they are keeping really treasures that have been brought from Artsakh to Vienna some decades ago, even some 2 centuries ago. And we said we should make them available to the broader public to show that we have treasures from Artsakh in Vienna. So among these treasures, for example, there were some manuscripts, for quite unusual manuscripts from Northern Karabakh and former Utik. And they have a lot of carpets, which is also quite interesting, and a lot of first prints from the printing press from Shushi. A lot of people came to the opening of the exhibition, which was during the conference. people from the Austrian politics, from church, from the sciences, and we had a very big echo on this exhibition, which was on display until the end of September. The second objective of the Vienna Conference and Workshop was to discuss in practical terms the protection of cultural property in Artsakh and realistic options for both conflict management and the protection of Armenian cultural property in Artsakh and the Armenian-Azerbaijani border area. Due to these main objectives, we said we need 2 days, and we divided the conference in 2 days. So the first day to raise awareness, which was the public day, and the second day was the closed workshop. This closed workshop, unfortunately, had become necessary in view of the harassment and disruptive actions of the Azerbaijani embassy in Vienna that had already arisen before the conference and were targeted against the conference organizers and all international participants. Oh, yeah. So on the first day, just to give you some numbers, on the first day we had about 100 people attendance of the conference. Again, not only stakeholders, but also people, interested people from Austrian politics, military, church, science. There were many representatives of international organizations like OSCE, UNESCO, and others. And on the second day, apart from our experts, we had about 30 experts. There were also some invited guests from the OECD Minsk Group and cultural property organizations, like from Switzerland, from Geneva, and from UK. Both days, I think, can be considered extremely successful because another goal was to bring the people together, to bring the Armenian experts together, or part of the Armenian experts together, so the younger generation of the Armenian experts in cultural property protection and the Austrian and international experts on cultural property protection to discuss the problems we are faced in Artsakh and in the border regions. So this is just a short program, so you can see it was a rather full program with a lot of interesting talks of various experts. During the conference, we had a lot of interesting discussions, and we found out that it was indeed very important that our experts, our CPP experts, mainly from the organizations of the Röhrig-Pact Society and of Blue Shield, International Blue Shield Austria, they gave us a lot of new ideas and aspects of cultural property protection. Among them, especially one of the founders of Blue Shield International, our dear Karl von Habsburg, who is one of the most famous persons in cultural property protection worldwide. And it was a great honor to be with him and to listen to him and to get his advices, what can be done in Armenia and Artsakh. Perhaps a few words regarding Blue Shield. Many people know what is UNESCO, a few people only know what is Blue Shield. First of all, Blue Shield was founded in 1996, and it is understood as a cultural equivalent to the Red Cross. So it was founded working under the principles of the Hague Convention of 1954, and as such it is understood as an NGO, and it does not work with state parties. So it works mainly with NGOs, various institutions, but also with civil society and very particular cooperation with military, with armed forces. So the missions and the goals are implemented through various areas of activity, including proactive protection and risk prevention, emergency response, legal compliance, and most importantly, especially for us, capacity building, education, and training. So, what was the main outcome of the conference? First of all, we learned a lot of things from the experts. But the main result, and I'm really so happy that I can announce it to you, that on September 15th, so right after the tragic events in Syunik and Mayatsour in Gerhakunik, we got the letter of the Blue Shield International Committee in the in UK that Blue Shield Armenia has been accredited and can be established, which means there is already Blue Shield Armenia, and this is really the consequence of the conference, because we really try to cooperate and to establish Blue Shield Armenia, National Committee of Blue Shield Armenia, to work together with the other specialists of Blue Shield International, especially my friends of Blue Shield Austria. I myself am a member of Blue Shield Austria, to work on cultural property protection. So we are now working in a provisional board, Blue Shield Armenia, but we have already started to work. And one of the main problems we are faced with in cultural property protection is that there is no joint work. So there are a lot of institutions or people or civil institutions, bodies that are trying to work in cultural property protections, but there is no unifying body. And now we are taking this task, and we have already started to work, to talk to the various institutions we have in Armenia. So I've just listed a few of them. The first four are the most important for the cooperation, and to develop joint plans for the work in cultural property protection. And as I said, this is a work in process, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of institutional members coming up, and our first General Assembly is planned for April 2023. The second point was, okay, now let's work together, but what is the first thing to be done? So, having learned some lessons from the conference and from our own practical work in the Blue Shield Austria, we decided that we will start to work on lists of the most endangered or most important cultural heritage elements in the border regions in Syunik, Tavush, and Gerhakunik, to make just lists. But what to do with these lists? We consider it extremely important to inscribe this important cultural property in the so-called The Hague Convention list, which is the International Register of Cultural Property under special protection. And if it's wished by the Armenian officials, we can also put our Blue Shield sign on these cultural properties. So this would be very important, and the effect, what is it? Once it is registered as cultural property and international under international special protection, of course, whenever something happens, we can directly go and sanction all kinds of violation against the Hague Convention and these inscribed properties. Another point is, we were talking about this today, about the importance of the civil society in cultural property protection, and also in maintaining, preserving cultural heritage, is to find bases with whom we can work. So usually we talk about a three-level work, which means civil society, state or government, and military. So first of all, of course, we will try to work with the civil society, which means we will start with educational programs, also go to the villages, work with the people in the villages, teach them how to care for their cultural property, because you know, very often in Armenia, people know in the villages that they have some really important cultural properties like cross stones or tombstones, churches, but very often they do not care for it. So we will try to do something in that respect. And the second thing we would like to do, and which is extremely difficult, as you can imagine, to get the military involved, actively involved in cultural property protection. What does this mean? We will try to bring our experts from our military, because we do offer special military courses for the whole world, because we are cooperating with the United Nations and with the United Nations Peace Corps, to teach them and to educate them what to do in a case of emergency, first of all, which means, for example, evacuate collections, museum collections, or protect immovable heritage, but also to train military in all things that are needed in armed conflict, like securing, if necessary, as I told you, evacuating cultural property collections, as well as all kinds of strategic and tactical implications of cultural property protections. Which means what we try to do now, or what is the outcome of the conference, first of all, that we really succeeded in establishing Blue Shield Armenia. And Blue Shield Armenia, of course, means, first of all, that we work in Armenia, because to work in Artsakh is another problem. But what is important, we will invite also the people who work in the protection of the cultural property in Artsakh, so there are various institutions. We will also invite them to our teaching and training courses, and we will also get involved with them. So members, and this is also quite important, because we are having our own statutes, and in our statutes, for example, institutional members can also be members outside of Armenia, all kinds of institutions that are involved in the cultural property protection in Artsakh or Armenia. And I think that's very important, because this shows that we need this close cooperation between Armenian stakeholders and international stakeholders. And Armenia does need the expertise of the international stakeholders, especially in cultural property protection. And I think that was one of the main outcomes of the Conference of Vienna, apart from very important quotations from our international experts, the really good media coverage we had in Europe, but also in Armenia and in the diaspora. And I think the next step will be next year to start with our training programs, and most hopefully also to have an official visit of Blue Shield International, and in particular of Karl von Habsburg, to Armenia, and if possible to Artsakh. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Yasmin for this wonderful presentation, but more importantly, the amazing work she's been doing for decades as a scholar and as an advocate for Armenian existence, an Austrian who now has been speaking Armenian fluently, several versions of Armenian fluently in many other languages for decades now. It's been a true privilege working with so many living legends as part of this committee and being part of this important conference, really humbling experience. I would like to invite an amazing member of our committee and the head of the Artsakh Heritage Office at Echmiadzin, the very Reverend Father Garegin Hampartsumyan, to tell us more about the Echmiadzin conference that happened last year.
Thank you very much, Simon. Your Eminence, Hovnan Serpazan, distinguished participants of this conference, dear guests. We gathered here and had discussions on a number of timely and very important topics which are related to the human, spiritual and cultural life of Artsakh Armenians. Contributors have already spoke about the human rights of Artsakh Armenians and their persecutions and overall daily unsafe life. A lot of important insight has been shared on the cultural heritage too. I am representing the Mother See of Holy Echmiadzin, the Department of Preservation of Cultural and Spiritual Heritage of Artsakh of the Mother See, which was established by the initiative of His Holiness Garegin II, Catholicos of all Armenians, back in 2020, to work with the relevant international organizations towards preservation of the Artsakh spiritual and cultural heritage. Before speaking on the cultural heritage preservation in general in Artsakh, I would like to acknowledge the role of our beloved Sirpazan, Hovnan Sirpazan, in this mission globally. Dear friends, since the very first days of existence of our department, Sirpazan Hayr has shown tremendous support in our mission and cause. I would like to inform you all that nearly all the conferences and academic gatherings and workshops of our church on Artsakh heritage organized over the past 2 years around the world have been inspired and greatly supported by His Eminence. And hence you saw his photos in Vienna, and he supported so much. The Echmiadzin conference actually was one of the initiators and great supporters, and now in the United States. And it has been a great privilege to work with Sirpazan Hayr, whose mentorship not only I, but many of us, I am sure, greatly value. So thank you very much, Sirpazan, and let us give a round of applause to Sirpazan. Throughout these past 2 years, the social media and official press have covered incidents of destruction of the Christian Armenian cultural heritage of Artsakh. Taking this into consideration and having in mind that all of us gathered here today have been closely following up with the news on such tragic incidents and acts of crime of Azerbaijan, I will not go into details of every single event of vandalism or destruction by Azerbaijan. Nevertheless, it is crucial to realize that the issue of preservation of cultural heritage is of key importance in the cultural policy of any state, both nationally and internationally. Today, the international community affirms the need for international cooperation on the preservation of cultural heritage and the promotion of intercultural understanding through its numerous conventions, declarations, or conferences. Having in mind the past experience of Holy Echmiadzin in interactions with the international organizations and high-ranked state officials, I have come to my own conclusion that at this stage it is crucial to take a more proactive approach to raise awareness on the millennia-old Armenian heritage of Artsakh in order to prevent acts of violence, or at least to reduce the probability of their occurrence. When we were reading with a few of our colleagues the text of communique today and also yesterday, one of the participants, Dr. Hras Chilingirian, said that, okay, this is a good text to present, however, we need an action plan. We need something that will trigger us to continue and to work towards preservation, some tangible plan. So, and I strongly believe that whatever was mentioned in communique will be reality. An action plan will be produced very shortly and will be distributed amongst us so that everyone, whether it is we are clergy or lawyers, international lawyers, or politicians, or anyone that is involved in this blessed cause can know what they can do in this mission of preservation of cultural heritage. Given the necessity of drawing attention to the issues of vandalism, desecration of the cultural heritage of Artsakh, complete or partial destructions, certain local church-affiliated committees were established in various countries around the world to help us in our mission. Such committees have been actively operating in Austria, in Russia, in Artsakh itself, in Brazil, in France, and most importantly here in the United States. To an extent that at some point the committee of the Western Diocese, led by Sirpazan Hayr, became the main leading force of the entire mission. I'm glad to state here that much substantial results have been achieved through collaboration of our office and the Armenian Bar Association as well. So far, 4 important reports have been produced by leading Armenian lawyers and have been presented to special rapporteurs in the United Nations and also to UNESCO and many other organizations. The text, also available in Russian with our joint signatures, were sent to relevant ministries of the Russian Federation and governmental as well as non-governmental organizations with certain points raised. This is done having in mind that at this moment, physically, the main peacekeeping mission in Artsakh is carried out by the Russians. Only a few days before traveling to LA, we received 2 responses from the Ministries of Culture and Foreign Affairs of Russia, which both basically stated that the Russian Federation is taking all the possible measures to protect the sacred sites which fall within the territory of their deployment. This leaves us with a realization that in the case of the heritage that is in the regions ceded to Azerbaijan, independent monitoring missions must be sent and every effort must be made in order to achieve this. Otherwise, the tragic story of Nakhichevan will inevitably reoccur in Artsakh, where currently only the satellite imagery research and evidence provides us with information at times when the church or a cemetery or a khachkar does not exist anymore. In this regard, Nagorno-Karabakh today and tomorrow conference is an important platform which would serve the purpose of drawing the international community's attention to atrocities committed against the cultural heritage and rights during the conflict of Nagorno-Karabakh to the issues of its preservation. As all of us know, the destruction of the Armenian cultural heritage of Artsakh is not only the result of the disastrous situation typical during wartime, but is a clearly set up policy of Azerbaijan, and this has been reiterated on various occasions throughout these 2 days. This well-developed and continuously implemented policy follows 2 main directions. On one hand, complete annihilation of the Armenian heritage, on the other hand, appropriation of the Armenian heritage by denying its origin. When, for instance, the medieval inscriptions in Armenian on the walls of churches and on gravestones are being erased, and then they are being presented as Caucasian Albanian by distorting historical facts and referring to the historical kingdom of Albania. What is more disgraceful is that despite all the evident acts of crime against the people and Christian heritage of Artsakh, Azerbaijan is trying to represent itself as a country of tolerance and multiculturalism. We were informed that just in 6 weeks, Azerbaijan is intending to hold a conference with the title Promoting Interreligious and Intercultural Dialogue for a Safer World. The venue of the conference, to our knowledge, is the headquarters of the UNESCO in Paris. No doubt, under the veil of dialogue, Azerbaijan will once again try to promote the made-up hypothesis and attempts to misappropriate Christian Armenian heritage of Artsakh. Dear attendants, such conferences Azerbaijan has been organizing over the past 30 and more years, and sadly, it is only after the recent war that we have been seriously addressing the damage that this brought by through such so-called academic activities of Azerbaijan, be it in the form of conferences, publications, or sponsorship, or some kind of educational or scholarships, etc., etc. Against all these great resources, the resources of our office in the Mother See of Holy Echmiadzin are not sufficient. Despite several publications on the topic of Artsakh heritage, one of which was distributed also among the participants of this conference by this diocese, and many other activities carried out, I strongly believe that there is an urgent need of consolidating all our available academic, diplomatic, ecumenical, and other resources around the diaspora and in Armenia, and I'm sure in this respect Sir Pazan Hayr will have some suggestions in his closing remarks. A very recent such achievement was our participation at the 11th General Assembly of the World Council of Churches, along with 16 other delegates from our Armenian Apostolic Holy Church. 5,000 clergy and lay people were representing nearly 400 churches around the world in Karlsruhe in Germany. On the final day, with the efforts of our delegation and the great support of our sister churches, a certain statement of condemnation was issued in which, unlike many other generic statements, Azerbaijan is deservedly called an aggressor and rights of the Christian Armenians of Artsakh are recognized. This is also a result of the conference that was held in the Mother See of Holy Echmiadzin back in September 2021, where the heads of all the major ecumenical institutions around the world, namely the World Council of Churches and the Council of European Churches, the President of the National Churches of the United States were in presence, and they received all the necessary information. And when it came to issuing this statement by the World Council of Churches, there was no other opinion about the issue. And again, from our recent experience, we would suggest to work towards dissemination of information on individual churches and monasteries, truly presenting them not only as precious cultural values, but more importantly as living heritage of our Christian people, of which they have been deprived. And one of the presenters here was talking about the importance of telling story about people, and I believe that it is also important when we want to draw attention on cultural heritage, we need to speak about individual churches and individual monasteries and the stories of those monasteries, because that brings more attention to the story of that very church and the community that once was living around that church, rather than talking about some 4,000 units of heritage or 162 churches and monasteries that are in the territory ceded to Azerbaijan, or thousands of khachkars. So that sounds very generic, but when you speak about Gitchavank, when you speak about the church of Saint Sarkis in Mokhrenis, Hadrut, that was destroyed back in 2022, actually just a couple of months ago, and it was evidenced by the satellite imagery research, then people understand what you're talking about. Esteemed participants of this conference, we greatly appreciate all the efforts that the organizing committee, led by our own Simon Marakian, has made to hold this conference, and we bring the blessings of Holy Echmiadzin to all of you. I'm confident that this conference and the results of this conference will make a significant contribution to the important mission of addressing the issues of preservation of cultural, religious, and historical heritage in our region and worldwide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Garagin. Just as a reminder, we just heard about the previous conferences that have taken place in Echmiadzin and Vienna, and earlier we read the communique from this current conference. So we're now going to learn more. Now we're going to learn more about the conference that has happened this weekend here. And one way to do it is to look at the program that was available earlier that lists most of the speakers who have participated in their biographies. We also have a list of the conference sponsors who are also listed here, the institutional supporters, which are almost all the Armenian study centers across the country and beyond, and also the conference sponsor, Woodbury University. We also have a list of individuals in there who have made donations to make this and other conferences possible, and also the members of the Artsakh Cultural Preservation Committee, many of whom, but not all, are here. And I don't like naming people because I always miss some and I feel terrible afterwards. So for the sake of my own anxiety, I'm not going to mention anyone, but I would like to say thank you to every single one of you, both conference members, staff of the Western Diocese, volunteers, so many of you, I don't know, probably close to 100 people have been part of this process in different stages of that. And it's been an amazing experience. And I want to mention that one reason, or the primary reason why this was a closed session, we wanted to have an intimate conversation about some tough issues that are important to discuss, and sometimes at open public venues, those conversations cannot happen, in part because some individuals who are influential but are also linked with stakeholder external organizations are not always allowed to have public engagement in a scholarly manner. And so that was one of the reasons we had an intimate closed session. But we followed Chatham House rules, which is we are allowed to share the ideas and the recommendations that have come out in those discussions. We're just not allowed to attribute to them to the specific speakers or their affiliations. So what we're going to do next is have a co-moderator, one co-moderator from each panel, and we've had 3 panels to present the discussions and recommendations that have come out in our panels. And the first co-moderator who will present, Dr. Artyom Tonoyan, the author of Black Garden Flame, a professor from the University of Minnesota, and formerly and now with Hamline University. I knew I was going to make a few mistakes today. Dr. Tonoyan, you have the floor.
Dear Sir Pazan, Your Eminence, and Simon, of course, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for coming. And I would like to extend also my thanks to the entire organizing committee, of which I am part. So I'll just pat myself in the back a bit. I would like also to thank our panelists who took the time and the effort to travel and put some thoughts to paper to facilitate to these conversations, which I think is a resounding success, if only because we got to meet each other. We've known each other through Zooms and throughout each other's work and writings, but it was something of a different quality when you meet people in person. So the panel that I was co-moderating with Simon was on the geopolitics and the diplomatic side of things. And there were 4 panelists, and these panelists were chosen very carefully through some deliberation because of the kind of work they have done and they are doing. And of course, I'm not going to mention their names, but I will just briefly tell you what they have been doing and what kind of work they are doing and what they're affiliated with. One of the panelists was a retired US diplomat who was posted in the Soviet Union in the waning days of the Soviet Union, and he got to see, as if in a front row, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the conflict when it was starting in Nagorno-Karabakh, but he also was part of the OSCE Minsk group representing the United States during the negotiations phase of the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. And he shared with us some intimate knowledge about the US role in the negotiations process, the conversations, the tough ones, the honest ones, and the ugly ones that took place with the Armenian and Azeri diplomats, and the recommendations and the US role in facilitating or managing the conflict, and what went wrong, mostly everything, and what could have been done, mostly everything that wasn't, and what happened in the aftermath. And the role of the Russian peacekeepers was also dealt with, the extent of the Russian peacekeeping operations, also the need of multilateralism in ensuring that the peacekeeping operations that are happening are successful, that the Armenian life in Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh is ensured, life and security are ensured, and what the US and European diplomats can and should be doing in order to facilitate to the multilateralism. Because if you're familiar with the conflict, most of the conflict management was outsourced, as it were, to Russia, because Russia was the nearest neighbor, was the biggest stakeholder in the region, and Russia chose to use that. And when push came to shove, the United States and the Europeans weren't available, or even weren't willing to be available to engage in peacekeeping and so on and so forth. So that's one of the presenters. The second presenter is affiliated with a Europe-based think tank, a person whose knowledge of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is on a granular level. The person knows the region, is from the region, is intimately involved in interviewing locals, affected populations, involved in talking with Armenian politicians, even Azeri politicians, and stakeholders and analysts, military analysts, government officials, and so on and so forth, who give us a report about the kind of work that person has been doing. I don't want to make this gender specific, so also there was much honesty in that person's assessment of the failures of Armenian diplomacy, of the failures of the Armenian government, also the failures of the government in Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh, who are sort of unsure about what to do, or not even unsure, who do not have a clear sort of agenda, a road map about their own agency, their own plan of action. And so what can be done and what should be done in order to facilitate the kind of work that these Armenian and Nagorno-Karabakh governments should be doing to ensure that they are on the same page, but also they are doing their utmost for the protection of Armenian life in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is of the utmost importance. A third person was or is an academic and a formerly practiced international human rights law, a person who has extensive knowledge of the region, but also worked in human rights organizations, in Human Rights Watch, and has traveled throughout the Central Asia, has been to Nagorno-Karabakh, has been to Armenia on multiple occasions, has written reports, and advocated on behalf of political prisoners in Azerbaijan, has advocated for upholding of human rights values and norms in repressive countries, and also teaches at a U.S. university here in California, at a very prestigious American university. And that person mostly spoke about, based on his prior experience as a human rights advocate and lawyer working at a human rights organization, spoke about the failures of the international human rights organizations in dealing with the abuses of Azerbaijan that were being inflicted on the Armenian prisoners of war, Armenian soldiers, and so on and so forth, and what these failures were. But also he recommended certain, not super concrete, but concrete enough steps on how to remedy some of these issues, some of these abuses, what kind of human rights legislations could be used, and what can be done to go after the figures, influential figures of the Azerbaijani regime, whether the Armenian community or Armenian lawyers or Armenian activists can use the Global Magnitsky Act to pursue cases against Azerbaijani officials who are implicated in human rights abuses against Armenians and so on and so forth. So it was a very important, very eye-opening presentation. Fourth presenter was another person involved in a human rights NGO slash think tank, a very important one, globally recognized, a very important human rights organization. But that person has extensive knowledge of the political landscape in Turkey and extensive knowledge of the political landscape in Russia. And so he brings a very unique perspective as a practitioner, but also an expert who sort of juggles these two different worlds, but two similar worlds in a sense, and he tried to give us a large geopolitical context within which the conflict became possible and even inevitable. And some of the arguments that he was making for the reasons of Armenia's defeat and Nagorno-Karabakh's defeat were failures of three assumptions on part of Armenia and Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. These assumptions were that Turkey will never get involved, which was proven wrong because Turkey was extensively involved diplomatically and militarily. The second assumption that Armenians had that proved to be wrong was the assumption that Russia will absolutely stand by Armenia as an ally because we have treaty obligations both through the CSTO framework, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and a mutual treaty. Obviously, the facts on the ground show that Russia wasn't willing to put its fingers on the scales on the side of Armenia, and that was another sort of assumption that was proven wrong. And the third assumption that was proven wrong was that the United States and EU would not let the conflict happen. But we know that that never became a prerogative for the US foreign policy establishment, and let alone for the Europeans. In the United States, mostly because it was the election season, and everybody was busy with either throwing mud at Trump or cleaning the mud off his face. So it was a very busy season, election season. Everybody was distracted. The press was distracted. They were a lot less interested in covering the conflict somewhere else than covering the political chicanery that was taking place in the United States. So that is in short a kind of summary for you. There was a lot of great questions from the audience, but the most important thing was that certain, I hate the word taboo, but certain, not taboos were broken, but certain honesty was present in the room, and a certain nuance was brought, I think, to the community even here, because a lot of the times the community in the United States, the Armenian American community in the United States, has, I think, and I think I'm right, sort of a distorted view of the political processes and the geopolitical processes in the motherland and in the region in general. And so based on these wrong understandings, we draw wrong conclusions. And I think the panelists did a wonderful job in presenting in a very honest, very rigorous and robust manner some of these misunderstandings and how these misunderstandings can be and should be addressed. And I would like to thank you, Simon, for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Donoyan. If you don't own a copy of Artyom's book, you should. It gives an amazing summary of the Soviet and Russian press's coverage of the conflict. Next, I'm going to invite another amazing scholar, Dr. Hevnar Watenpaugh, the author of The Missing Pages. I'm sure many of you have read it. If you haven't, you should. And she will summarize the cultural preservation panel that took place earlier this day.
Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Sarpazan Haid, for your spiritual and intellectual leadership, and friends from around the world. Thank you for all we had a very frank discussion. The panel was organized with my co-conspirator, Professor Christina Moranci, the Mesrop Mashtots professor of Armenian culture at Harvard University. And so the two of us wanted to put together a conversation, not on cultural heritage per se. We know the facts all too well, but we wanted to spark a conversation between artists and creators of art, historians, art historians, and cultural heritage professionals at all levels of the cultural heritage industry. We had 4 speakers, and a major theme that emerged, I think, from maybe all of the panels, and particularly ours, I think, was the importance of communicating a compelling and, of course, truthful message about the plight of Karabakh, its people, its culture, and the threats that loom over Armenian religious and cultural heritage of Karabakh. And so figuring out how to frame our message, the most effective way of communicating it in the right way, and to continually do that, because one of the statements that stayed with me from Artyom and Simon's panel was that pressure works. So how to keep up that pressure in the right way and over a long period of time. This is not going to be a short-term project. One of our speakers discussed the role of the visual image, and especially of photojournalism, in shaping narratives about Karabakh and the conflict in the press. And that speaker emphasized the importance of telling the story of the people of Karabakh today, not only the medieval monuments as much as we love them and value them and learn from them, but also the way in which the contemporary people of Karabakh inhabit these monuments and make them alive through their everyday practices as well as through their spiritual practices. The medieval monuments are beautiful, they are important for the history of architecture, but they are, and some of them unfortunately were until recently, living monuments in the setting of ordinary and beautiful lives, including children playing, baptism, prayer, daily life. One of the speakers also discussed the Azerbaijani official historiography and propaganda, and they emphasized the need to understand better the official Azerbaijani propaganda and the way it incorporates a fictional history that erases Armenians from the history of the Caucasus, and especially from Karabakh and surrounding regions. The observations were made that the rhetoric coming from the highest levels of the Azerbaijani government has perhaps escalated from claiming Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan to the current movement of claiming that Armenia is actually Western Azerbaijan. And I think we were all shocked when we saw some evidence that, according to this historiography, even Echmiadzin is an ancient Turkish temple. So the point was driven home that we really need to understand this narrative, not simply dismiss it as being completely fictional, understand how it functions, how it is formed, and so we can begin to not only counter it, but understand what our strategy should be to counter it for the sake of telling the truth. The next 2 speakers spoke about the international cultural heritage regime, and there were some very illuminating and very frank discussions about how it operates, its severe shortcomings, its blind spots, with examples from Karabakh, but also from around the world, Syria, Cambodia, Mali, and a number of other places. And the point that was reiterated over and over again is that cultural heritage is not simply architecture, is not only architecture, but entire communities that make that architecture their home and inhabit it in a very deep way. Observations were made that international cultural heritage tends to see cultural heritage in post-conflict settings as a medium for dialogue, for communication, for celebration, for healing past wounds, and even for reconciliation. This is an overly rosy view of the possibilities offered, that cultural heritage offers the possibility of making all of these theoretically wonderful outcomes possible. And the point was made that as Armenians, we need to understand this kind of pressure to rally around cultural heritage for reconciliation purposes, and to be prepared for what it means, what it demands, and how to understand it. The speaker spoke very powerfully about a cautionary tale, which was the example of Mostar. In that situation, during the Civil War, an entire city was destroyed, including a beautiful and iconic 15th century bridge. Post-conflict, international heritage organizations poured into Mostar and with large amounts of funding and beautifully restored the bridge. The bridge was seen as a powerful symbol. It is a bridge that connects. The bridge repairs divisions. Bridges bring people together. So all of these are really beautiful ideas. And so they sounded very good at one level, and they seem very optimistic. And as the speaker emphasized, in reality, the local communities who lived around the bridge resented the focus of international heritage on the bridge and the neglect of the ruined houses and the difficult economic conditions that the inhabitants of Mostar still endure. And so the speaker spoke about the simmering resentments that continue to exist in this particular example, and the complete disconnect between the rebuilt bridge as a symbol of rebuilding and bridging divisions and healing, and the actual reality that seems very much the opposite. So that was really something for us to really digest and think about as a cautionary tale. Our next speaker spoke about the cultural heritage industry and its issues from a more global and macro perspective. She made the point that buildings and architecture can be repaired if they are destroyed partially or wholly. They can be rebuilt. There are all kinds of professionals in architecture, preservation architecture, and the construction industry today that can recreate buildings from the past. But the authentic building from the past cannot be resurrected, and living traditions cannot be repaired, history cannot be repaired, trauma cannot be healed. While a great deal of funding can become available under the right circumstances to repair a work of architecture or a work of art, or maybe a museum that has been looted or damaged, buildings do not stand on their own as empty shells. Funding and resources also need to be found to ensure that a monument that has been restored is set up with a whole set of economic processes and social processes that will ensure its continued maintenance way into the future, and hopefully to make it self-sustainable. Cultural heritage, the person made the point that cultural heritage is always located in a social context with its multi-layered relationships of power, and the whole context needs to be addressed to ensure actual preservation on the longer term. An important point that was made is that often tourism is thought of as the kind of economic process that goes with cultural heritage, and they made the point that that is an easy answer, and it is not enough to ensure sustainable economic futures for communities. And other ways need to be found to empower the local community, to involve them in the care and maintenance and further development for cultural heritage. And I think this was an idea that was echoed in Jasmine's presentation about the planned work of Blue Shield Armenia. And I'm very optimistic that that will yield results. So that was, in general, the idea about our panel, and we also had a very interesting discussion where some very pointed questions were asked and led us into a process of reflection about the many problems associated with the international cultural heritage regime and the ways in which we as advocates for the cultural and religious heritage of Artsakh need to find ways to move the conversation forward in a way that supports the cultural rights of all the communities that make Karabakh their home. Thank you.
Thank you, Helnash, for that excellent summary and all the work that you do. Now I'd like to invite an internationally renowned attorney, Karne Kirkonyan, who has done a lot of amazing things, but in my view, the most important one, the ongoing ICJ case, representing as part of the team that represents Armenia against Azerbaijan. The biographies of most of the speakers of the conference are in the booklet, so please refer to it for more details. Mr. Karne Kirkonyan.
Thank you, Simon. And again, as Haid Karakin mentioned, I think it's worthwhile to underline yet again the role that Sirpazan Haid has played in his committed leadership to these conferences, and especially to our continued work. I think it takes a lot of inertia to move people that are otherwise busy. And Sirpazan Haid, you've done a tremendous job. I'd like to discuss, I guess, in strict Chatham House rules, without attributing any information to speakers, some of the general themes that were discussed from a factual standpoint, from a legal standpoint, from an outcomes and resolutions standpoint. And I think we started the panel really kind of identifying the fact that we're at a tremendously existential moment in Artsakh's very long history. We identified that this moment, in a lot of ways, takes a lot of us back to an era that we thought we had moved beyond. And it's interesting because throughout the discussions over the last couple of days, and in some discussions outside of these circles, the issue of genocide and what relevance it has, and I always say that, it's not so much about recognition anymore, because all three of the OSCE Minsk group co-chairs have all recognized the genocide. But as one of our speakers mentioned during the panel, when Erdogan brings up the genocide in 2020 in Baku, he opens the door to its relevance, because the story that needs to be told, or the story that lawyers are telling, is one of a continuum, is one of a historical progress, or perhaps progress is the wrong word to use for that. But I think that during the course of our panel, we identified a number of really important themes that I think need to be disseminated, need to be considered. There was an overwhelming consensus. And I have to say, the panelists that were on this panel, it was humbling, because they are people who have had their hands in the dirt of human rights, who have fought the battles of human rights and continue to fight the battles of human rights, not only in Armenia for Artsakh, but also in international tribunals throughout the world. In fact, as we speak, they are doing that. And so I take the fact that there's consensus on certain points, on certain themes, I take that as a very critical and really kind of crucial underpinning to what we're discussing. And some of those underlying facts that we found tremendous consensus on really came out in a question that I had asked. I asked, how close are we to the deliverance of ethnic cleansing and genocide? And the response was, we're in it. We're in it now. And as I reflected after the conference, after our panel, as I speak to some young students in schools, I have to remind them that the genocide didn't happen on April 24th, right? It's not a one-day event. And sometimes when you're in the boat, it's hard to kind of determine where you are in that sea. But I think our speakers really well define the fact that we are actually in the process of ethnic cleansing. That is a state-sponsored policy that is undergoing at this time. The feelings of insecurity that are created were brought up. The actions taken against Artsakh Armenians and their livelihood and their security was mentioned. And another really important parallel came out, a factual parallel that is really important, I think, to underline. And that is that from a comparative sense, when we talk about international law, human rights, and the Artsakh experience, and specifically the rhetoric that we're hearing from Azerbaijan, from the highest levels of Azerbaijani government, one of the speakers mentioned that this rhetoric is the rhetoric that came out of Rwanda prior to the Rwandan genocide. It's the rhetoric that the Nazis used in the extermination of the Jews. That's the rhetoric that we're hearing. And that was a theme that was pronounced throughout our panel. And another theme which really kind of jumped out was when one of the panelists, speaking about the wealth of information, the wealth of evidence that is at play here, and I'm not going to paraphrase. Well, it's a paraphrase, I guess, and I'm not doing it justice. But he essentially said, this doesn't happen. You don't have the leaders of states calling for the extermination of people in the modern era. You don't have that. But we do here. We do here. And so the element of state-sponsored ethnic cleansing and genocide is important, as is the issue of intent. The fact that it's a clear intention. And I think those are some of the important kind of factual themes that were brought up during the discussion. And it feeds, quite frankly, into one of the legal principles that we discussed, and that being that of self-determination, which, of course, is of increasing importance. We hear it increasingly in the rhetoric and in the discourse of the future of Artsakh, what that means. And we learned that international law and human rights are really at the core of that particular Artsakh question, and that they lay a crucial foundation as to which two directions to take in the self-determination question. Although it sounds, now I'm going to spring it upon you. And so here is the question. No music this time, okay. But, are we in a world of internal self-determination, which is what Azerbaijan has advocated? In fact, it doesn't even advocate that anymore. It just says they don't exist. Or are we in a world of external self-determination? And I think that the analogy, the dichotomy there is really important to understand. Is this a Quebec-type situation where we're going to try to protect language, protect cultural ties to the motherland? Or is this a Kosovo situation where we're dealing with likely extermination? And the consensus on the facts has told us kind of what those facts are. Which direction do we argue? Which direction do we go? And so it turned out that the answer to that question is in fact fundamental. And, we we were able to then kind of debunk some of the critical themes that are permeating, the space. And I think one of the speakers in the previous panel, I think it was one of our speakers, mentioned a very interesting analogy about the sand in the air, that there's obfuscation, there's confusion that Azerbaijan tries to put out with respect to some of these legal principles. When you look at the facts, the idea of self-determination for Artsakh is relatively clear. It really is. You can't have coexistence under an Azerbaijani authoritative fascist regime. It's just impossible. It's impossible because the outcome is ethnic cleansing and genocide. Now, that's not a tolerable outcome for a modern liberal world. And we learned also from pretty frank disclosures throughout our discussions of the unfortunate misunderstanding of these international legal principles by government actors, by influencers, and how those missteps have affected kind of where we are in this discourse today. We learned about how internal politics plays a role, not just geopolitics, but also internal politics plays a role in the dissemination of critical information, as well as the interpretation of that information in terms of legal principles and legal narratives. And I think that that's kind of how we ended our discussion with pretty detailed and I would say active participation from the audience, is kind of trying to understand what those narratives are, why those narratives are important. And it really kind of pinpointed a couple of things I want to highlight. And that is, what is the role of international law? What is the role of human rights? One of the guests asked about the timing. This is an urgent situation. On one end, we speak about ethnic cleansing and genocide happening right now. On the other end, we speak of international legal principles and legal cases that can go on for 5 or 6 years. What's the role? How does that work? And I think it was important because we outlined in response to that question the fact that legal proceedings are a valuable tool outside of the courtroom as well. We know that cases don't stop invading armies, but the analogy that I like is the fact that it's an arrow in a quiver. It's something that you can use in foreign policy, we learned. We learned it's something that is relevant to diplomatic discussions. We learned that it's something relevant to negotiations, and why not? On negotiations relevant to Artsakh's status and the reality of the security and safety of Artsakh Armenians. And with that, I think that it's really appropriate to kind of tie in something that occurred to me afterwards. And when you have a confluence of consensus on facts, on law, and then you hear certain statements from politicians that actually resonate, there's some value to that. And somebody who had, the foreign minister of Artsakh, who had visited here just a few weeks ago, David Babayan, has made it abundantly clear that the Artsakh red line is a really simple red line. That in this moment in Artsakh's history, there is a red line. And that red line is that Artsakh cannot be part of Azerbaijan because it will result in ethnic cleansing and genocide. And in that simple statement, as we heard during our panel, we have really the thrust of the narrative that is fundamental to really understanding and realizing what it is that we can do as intellectuals, as lawyers, as, it's interesting, my wife would probably agree that I separated intellectual from lawyer, but intellectuals and lawyers, to really try to pinpoint the the material factor. What is it that's going to move us from one scenario to the other scenario? And legal narratives do have an impact. And I think that was abundantly clear when one of our speakers brought in examples from other human rights situations. Other situations where you had ethnic cleansing, where you have genocide, and where the consolidation on particular narratives made a difference in actually preventing future obtuse outcomes. And we see that. It's hard in a democratic, liberal environment to unify messages. It's a lot easier for an authoritarian state to send a communique to all of its friends and plants throughout the world and say, you're going to say this, this, and this. We don't and we can't work like that. But we do have an obligation to understand the legal points that drive the outcomes that are desirable. And we do have an obligation, and this is what we kind of concluded with, to be able to create those opportunities where intellectuals in their own disciplines can take those messages to understand those frameworks, the legal frameworks, the theoretical frameworks, the ethical frameworks, and move them into the direction of creating an opportunity for Artsakh that is reflective of the principle of self-determination, and the security of Artsakh can be guaranteed for the years to come. History is long, and this is one of the more difficult periods in our history, but I think the examples that were brought out by our panelists made absolutely clear that we are on the side of the right. It's about communicating that. It's about telling that story to somebody who finds themselves in the middle, the mediator, the thinker, the influencer who's trying to make a determination. And I'd like to conclude with saying that one of the things that was really important to me as I was listening to our speakers is that while there's a lot of work that goes into moving the needle, as one of our speakers mentioned, we've done so much of the work. I looked across the panel at the particular individuals, and I know the lives they led during the war, before the war, after the war. And I think that we're, and I know that that's replicated on many levels throughout the various disciplines of our Armenian intellectuals. It's about consensus, it's about understanding the narrative, it's about effectuating the narrative with an aggressiveness that is fearless. And we have that opportunity, and I'm proud to say that the panel, I felt, not only exhibited that in their own individual work, but after the panel, everybody was very much interested and intrigued with the possibility of continuing that work together under the direction of the committees established, as well as the work that's ongoing in this field. So, thank you.
As we near the end of this conference, I'd like to acknowledge that Armenian communities, including in the diaspora, have been feeling helpless and hopeless. Just like Azerbaijan left no stone unturned, literally, in erasing our heritage in Nakhichevan and tries to do the same in Artsakh today, we need to leave no stone unturned in ensuring continuous Armenian existence in Artsakh, in Armenia. And the diocese, the Western Diocese, has been the facilitator of this discussion. And I think it is very fitting, and it's a continuation of our history where the church was often the place for Armenian existence, where we overcompensated our lack of political autonomy by being devoted to the church, by worshiping our sacred sites, and ensuring our survival through our faith and culture. To close this conference, I'd like to invite a most dedicated, effective, and humble leader, His Eminence, Archbishop Hovnan Derderian.
First, I would like to extend my immense gratitude to the all participating academics and professionals for making this conference a milestone, a school of educating ourselves with the realities which challenge us in the journey of our history in the context of world history. My special thanks to our beloved brother in Christ, the Reverend Father Karekin Ambartsumian, the Director of the Office for the Preservation of the Religious and Cultural Monuments in Artsakh, as well as representing our beloved Veapa His Holiness Karekin II, and thank you for reading the message of His Holiness Harsup, and Harsup will be celebrating the Badarak tomorrow, when we will also have a special requiem for the martyrs of the 44 days of the war, as well as the recent martyrs who have lost their lives with the vision of protecting and guarding our motherland, Armenia. My special thanks also to the committee members, chaired by Simon Magakian, a young professor teaching at the University of Denver, Colorado, and I just heard the new term, cultural crime, that he is specializing there. And Simon is a fireball, and he knows how to inspire people. And thank you, Simon, for chairing this committee, and be assured that you will be called upon to take on many other responsibilities in the future, as I learn that you are a good leader. And equally my respect and reverence to all the members from the States, from Europe, and from Armenia, who have continuously responded to my calls, my request to be part of this committee, as well as my thanks to the welcoming committee chaired by Rafi Kendirjan. Nothing could have been done without the team efforts. Each and every one of them have contributed for the success of this conference and the upcoming conferences. To make justice to the efforts in organizing this conference, we all need to make the commitment to respond to the challenges which obviously threaten the existentialism of our nation, the land, and the culture. We do realize that we all are in the fight to bring justice to our cause. This may seem to be an almost impossible task, yet we have no reason to fail. Thus, our mission takes us all into a non-ending journey in the restoration of justice. Our team efforts will focus on the mission of the preservation of the Armenian religious and cultural monuments professionally, in a structured manner, not only for the sake of our nation, but equally to make justice to the history of Christianity. Therefore, my call on you all would be to stay in the circle of friends who pursue the noble intention of preserving the truth of history and the related heritage. This I regard as a calling from God. Erasure of history must be addressed as a threat to the history of humanity and civilization. The key question which remains with us today is to put forward the following steps. A, set up a conference combining and coordinating all 4 conferences and establish an executive body. Why? To set forth the purpose of these conferences and also make sure that we also apply and realize all the proceedings which have been the outcome of the all 4 conferences. B, identify the practical ways to address the political, legal, and cultural aspects of the issue at stake, namely the preservation of the historical and cultural monuments. And finally, educate our people and the world community with the truth of the facts and secure all the necessary resources to succeed and also to bring to life the security of our rights in Artsakh and in Armenia. God be with us all. Amen. Շնորհակալություն ձեր բոլորի ներկայության համար եւ իմ երախտագիտություն անգամ եւս բոլորիդ անխդիր այս կոնֆերանսի գազագերբությանը եւ նաեւ վստահաբար ձեր պատրաստակամության համար քալիք կոնֆերանսներուն, որոնք իրապես մեզի վստահված սրբազան եւ նվիրական առաքելություն ունեն։ Այս պահուն ես կուզեմ հրավիրել մեր Sound of Children երեխաները, որովհետեւ այս կոնֆերանսը մենք ավարտենք երեխաներու ձայնով, անոնց տեսիլքով եւ անոնց նաեւ հանձնարարությամբ, որ մեր ազգը ունի զավակներ, որոնք իրապես մեր հբարդությունն են եւ նաեւ մեր երազն են, քալիքի հույսն են եւ նորաշալույսն են մայր հայրենիքի Արցախի եւ ողջ սփյուռք աշխարհին։ Հրավիրենք մեր փոքրերը, որովհետեւ սրահեն մեզ մուտք գործեն եւ իրենց երկերով նաեւ խանդավառեն։ Խնդրեմ։
Yes, Koche, Hayrelik im